I feel like when I was growing up, everybody was skeptical of the internet, or at least like where I grew up, everybody was skeptical of the internet. They had parents who told them, "Hey, don't believe everything you read online." I actually grew up being told, "Don't believe everything you read," like in a book, you know? I think people who are just a little bit younger than me actually grew up with this idea that, okay, online you should be skeptical, but if it's in a book, it's totally believable because it happens to be in a book, which is really low IQ. But yeah, I mean, I was told these different things and I really internalized it, right? I was told that there are certain websites you should not go to, and I really internalized that. You know, like I listened to my parents because, in my mind, even if they couldn't find me on those websites, if I went on there, I would be doing something wrong, you know? And I didn't want that on my conscience. I had very much the sense of like, okay, if I go do that, this is a bad thing to do. And so I was very skeptical and scared of the internet in many respects. I did not have a smartphone until I was well into being 16 years old, and I didn't end up developing serious usage patterns of the smartphone until later, and ultimately, of course, I got rid of it, as many of you who watch this channel are aware. Um, and so, I feel like I have a different relationship with the internet in comparison to many of the people that watch me, people from bigger cities, because where I grew up, there was not widespread internet access. Where I grew up, people had dial up. If you were really lucky, you had satellite internet, and many of the people that I grew up with were too poor to have cell phones, or if they could afford them, it wasn't worth having it because there was very little cell coverage where I lived. And so there was this odd situation where a lot of the kids that I went to school with, okay, maybe they had a game console, but it was one generation behind, right? They had the PlayStation 2, they had the original Xbox. I only knew one kid with the original Xbox. I lent him some games and we were very good friends, but um, you know, everybody else was on the 360 once the PS4 and Xbox One were out and all that stuff. Everyone was still on the 360, but um, and a lot of people were still on the PS2, like I say. Uh, and so it was different, right? It was a different kind of environment to be in, and computers were not in the classroom as quickly as I think they were for other people, nor were tablets and things like this. People where I grew up had a different relationship to technology, particularly me, because I had parents, at least one. Um, I would say I had one that was very educated on this stuff because they had worked with them and things like that. And then another parent that, knew the stuff that you're supposed to tell kids but didn't have extensive knowledge of computers. So my dad, for example, would tell me growing up, you have to have these really long passwords and they have to be different for every account. You should even have different emails across different accounts so that they can't be linked to one another. So you have like a larger, uh, I don't know, web, like privacy web, like your internet footprint isn't as big, things like this. I grew up being told you should never put your face on the internet, which, of course, I did break that rule primarily by convincing my parents that it wasn't all that big of a deal, which I actually regret now in retrospect. Like, I did not know as a child that AI and all this stuff was going to create this massive surveillance network that can create a model of you just like that. I didn't predict that. I don't think very many people did. And so that was a mistake looking back. But hey, we got to live with our mistakes, right? Um, and so uh, I grew up with this very particular perspective, right? And so when I eventually did start using social media, when I eventually became someone, um, on YouTube, for example, I was posting at a pretty young age, I'd say. I was very skeptical of the things I would see online, the people I would meet online, and I had caution, right? But I think nowadays, um, a lot of that caution is gone. People see something online, and if it confirms like an emotion that they have, they just believe it, right? There's not this impulse to go look it up and check. There's not this inherent skepticism, um, and there's not a distrust of of institutions, right? Of how institutions might use data like your face, your name, things like this. I mean, there was a time on the internet when putting your name out there was considered super bad. My parents wanted me to use an alias on Facebook when I made a Facebook growing up, and they were not happy with me when they found out that I didn't do that. You know, so I feel like I portrayed myself like I was following all the rules. I did not follow all the rules. I did follow the rules about websites you shouldn't go to. I did follow that rule, but I think ultimately, um, there is a certain level of trust that people have with the internet nowadays that is not it's not warranted. Look at the fact that when you're in a restaurant and you see a kid screaming and crying, what's the first thing they do? They hand them a tablet. Where are they? They're on YouTube. They're playing these tablet games and things like this. And there's an entire discussion to be had there about how, okay, these kids aren't learning to deal with their emotions. That's a separate issue. It's a big one. But just the fact that there's so much trust being lent to these social media platforms that are owned by giant corporations that have been proven to be doing shady stuff, um, that's not great. What kind of information could these kids potentially be being exposed to? Uh, and they're not encouraged to have the critical capacity to um, to be skeptical of all this different information, nor do they have the ability to disseminate this information simply due to the age that they're at. If you're at a certain age, you shouldn't be allowed online. Or else, you are at the whims of an information space that the adults in your life have absolutely no control over. There's a positive side to this, right? The positive side to this is people in abusive situations may have more access to help. I am certainly not advocating for, an Orwellian kind of approach to this where everybody has to put in their ID and things like this. Although doing that might get a lot of the normies off the internet, it might get everybody else off the internet too. So, I mean, definitely not for something like that. But the simple fact is that parents need to be making different decisions about how these children are behaving in relation to the internet, as well as like what even their beliefs about the internet are. But it's a difficult thing to enforce because if they look at their peers in an entirely separate world, who are they more likely to believe? Their peer that tells them, no, this is all good, or their parent that's very skeptical. I was in a pretty tightly knit sort of situation, so I was more of the mind of like, okay, I should trust my parents, I should trust whoever the authority figures are in this situation. I was that kind of kid. In spite of some of my rebellious tendencies, the tendencies that we all have, that was what I leaned towards. And this idea of hierarchies, it's something that different people are going to respond to differently. And there's only so much that culture can enforce that. And so how do we actually fix this problem? I don't know. But it's undeniable to me that there is a problem, because if you look at some of the crazy people that are out there today, that have unrestricted access to the internet, zero skepticism whatsoever of the things that they're looking at all day, all the time, that's just driving them crazy. Um, some skepticism would do them good. Some skepticism would do them a lot of good. And they just don't have any. It's like, what do you do about that situation? I have no fucking idea, man. No clue. Um, I don't know. It's such a complicated topic. Like, I feel like I've wanted to talk about this. I've wanted to talk about this, and yet I don't know how. Um, yeah. At the end of the day, probably best to get out of here.